Good morning, Sawadee Krab. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, greetings from Bangkok. Very happy to be here, and I would also like really to thank Chula University for making this linkage between climate change and water management, because this is actually a link that UNDP, and we are working in most of the Asian countries, and we see this link as being an absolutely crucial one, and I would say an increasingly strong one. You have a very strong interdependence, and I'm going to talk about it in more details in a minute. Just to say that the conference title reads after COVID-19, and you're right, we need to anticipate, but I would say also during COVID-19 pandemic, especially if the COVID is to stay with us longer than we had thought. And I think there are two reasons, to address those issues during the pandemic already. The first one is that the pandemic doesn't take away the climate emergency. Most of the headlines today, these days are about the pandemic, but you may have seen that the World Meteorological Organization announced that the last year, 2021, was one of the 7 hottest years since record began way back, and that the average temperature is actually 1.1 degree above pre-industrial level. So that's actually something that should call our attention and call for immediate action. The second reason to act now during the pandemic is that there is absolutely no time to lose for water management. And again, if we look at the headlines about extreme events, disaster last year, that takes us, far away to Madagascar, where a drought is actually creating famine for over 1 million people. That takes us to the Arctic, where ice is melting. But very often it takes us to Asia and the Pacific, because Asia and the Pacific is one of the most vulnerable regions, if not the most vulnerable region to climate change and disaster. And just recalling, it was about floods and droughts in China or India, and sometime in sequence, as Benoit mentioned, this kind of erratic trend of flood and droughts. It was about the typhoon Rai or Odette in the Philippines. It was very recently about the tsunami in Tonga, and just yesterday, the alert for heavy rains in the Philippines. Now, if you look at all those examples that I just gave, there is one common point. And the common point is that they're all water related. And if you look at the statistics, the estimate that UNDP makes, and that shared by many others, is that about 75% of all natural disasters over the last 20 years are actually water related. That doesn't mean that all of them are linked to climate change, but many of them actually are. And we already see that both the frequency and the severity of this climate change water-related disaster is going to increase. Now, reflecting on what it means, this water crisis. One dimension, there are 3 dimensions actually, in UNDP view. One is the most visible one, that's the disaster. So the immediate damage that you saw in Tonga or in other Asian countries, destruction of houses, destruction of infrastructure, but then also scarcity of drinkable water supply and disease that results from it, but also longer-term impact on livelihood. So that dimension is a disaster-related, very visible one. You have what I would call the kind of undesired increasing water supply. Here melting of glaciers, rising sea level, salination of river or delta water, and this kind of undesired increasing water supply is accelerating, but at the same time it's still very gradual, so it doesn't make the headline. And to us, where we are, most of us, it's not that visible, but it is becoming very visible to the villagers in the Himalayas, to the farmer of the Mekong River Delta, and to the people of Vanuatu and many islands in the Pacific and other oceans. So that's something that is an important dimension for us to look at. And the third dimension is the scarcity one. Water scarcity, it's lack of access to drinking water, water supply, but it's also disappearing rivers, disappearing lakes, and the risk of conflict that goes with it, that compounds, the impact on the population. So all three dimensions that I just shared with you all require management. Some of this management is immediate action, sometimes reactive. Other part is long-term. But I think, in UNDP analysis, what is important is not purely technical. It's not purely about natural resource management, because you have a very strong human dimension attached to it. And I would say particularly in Asia and the Pacific. Why? Because not in all countries, but in many countries of Asia and the Pacific, population is still growing. So you have a demographic challenge and increasing tension and needs for water. The second reason is that you have urbanization. Urbanization is growing fast in Asia and Pacific. In many countries, they've passed the bar of 50% of the population living in cities. And that has a lot of implication also in terms of needs for water and water management. And the overall, human dimension is very much there because we are making progress over the years. If you look at the, and that's UNDP Human Development Report is very clear about this. About the 30 years, we've seen unprecedented gains in human development overall, in poverty, for instance, but not so much in terms of access to water and sanitation. And again, as Benoit mentioned, billions of people are still lacking this access. And what we are seeing now is actually the gains that we made in human development are at a double risk. One is the COVID-19 pandemic, which has caused already a reverse in human development. There was a UNDP report published last year about it, but also the climate that is impacting human development. So all the more reason to look at management. Management can be global, and it's important, to really realize there is actually a global management, a global governance that addresses issues. This is a Paris Agreement in particular, and the UN conference of the party, the last one being in COP26 in Glasgow. It's important, it's better to have it rather than not to have it, and it's important to have all member states part of it. But we are still not really on target for the objective of 1.5 degrees. There is also management through funding instruments that aim at providing financial resources to developing countries and also transfer of technology. And that's, for instance, the Green Climate Fund. Many projects actually touch on water management. You also have ocean. Oceans are very much part of the engagement of the international community, and a number of countries, Norway or India, Indonesia and Vietnam have been very active in looking at oceans. That's SDG 14, but a lot of water-related issue. And you also have specific initiatives like the archipelagic and island states led by Indonesia with UNDP support that look at a lot of climate issues and water management issue in over 40 islands and archipelagic states across the world. So that global dimension is important. It's important to have it, but it has to deliver much more. At the regional level, if you look at Asia, we don't have actually very strong regional management and governance. We have at the ASEAN level, we have the AHA Center, but looks much more at a disaster. We have the Mekong River Commission that was established years ago with UNDP support. The SARC is also not particularly prominent in terms of water, so not a strong engagement. That there could be more opportunity to look at water management at the regional level in Asia. I think UNDP would be very keen to work with countries on this regional cooperation. And then we come to the country level, national level. It's about the nationally determined contributions, mitigation and adaptation that were already covered. It's about institutions, and we see that in many countries, water research institutes or water department in ministries are gaining additional capacity for research and development and policy making, and that's something that UNDP very strongly support in the countries we are working in. You have a policy dimension with increasing, an integrated approach where water is actually fully integrated into longer-term strategies, longer-term plan, and you have increasing, infrastructure for water management, and we saw, a number of examples through the Raya project in Thailand. Let me just look back to the COVID pandemic because we can't get away from it. It is actually, a little bit concerned that if you look at the stimulus package that was put together by a number of countries with huge amounts of financial resources devoted, the impact on the environment is actually quite negative for the moment. And we seem to be going more toward a brown growth than a green recovery. And there is obviously a risk of, return to business as usual, or maybe even worse, with a sole desire to actually catch up on growth, catch up on investment at the expense of environment and sustainable development. And I think UNDP is very clear that we see, the sustainable recovery as being a green one. And that's because we also see there is a paradox in what we are seeing for the moment. This is an existential paradox because if you go back to business as usual, you're opening the way to actually more pandemics, more zoonoses by overexploiting natural resources. And you're in the long term, humanity may be choosing extinction by not acting. But there is also an economic paradox, and I think it's extremely important for policymakers, institutional organizations to actually analyze this economic paradox, because while we're still, very heavy on fossil fuel, we are very weak on energy transition. We're not going green enough, but we see at the same time that investment in sustainable development pays off. There is an economic return in this investment. Circular economy creates green jobs. And just to give an example, data from the World Health Organization that estimate that every time you invest $1 in water and sanitation, you generate 4 times this, of economic return through increased productivity. The United Nations also estimate that every dollar you invest in risk reduction and prevention leads to saving about $15 in post-disaster recovery and the costs associated to it. So this is a very compelling economic case. And I would say that on the qualitative side, UNDP project evaluation show that restoring degraded mangroves in coastal areas, putting coral reef and seagrasses under improved management, regenerating micro watershed are actually investment that all generate triple or quadruple benefit in terms of building ecosystems resilience, protection of water resources, and also GDP and income for vulnerable communities. So there is a very strong economic case for climate change action and improved water management as part of it. Now, sometimes the picture that emerge from the headlines is pretty grim. So to use a fashionable word, I would like to inject a little bit of optimism in this session. First, to note that green and blue investments as part of the stimulus package have actually grown if you compare the measure taken last year in 2021 compared to the first year, 2020. So the needle is shifting a little bit, not enough, but you see an encouraging trend. And I think also encouraging, signals, concrete examples are coming from the work that UNDP does in Asia and the Pacific with governments and civil society and the private sector. That's something we've seen with our work for the NDCs prior to COP26, where, we have a flagship program called Climate Promise. And we've supported 120 countries across the world, but many in Asia and the Pacific, to increase the level of ambition of the NDC, both for mitigation and adaptation. And we've seen good progress and announcement before or after the COP, like in Cambodia, where we work with a government, and now working on the implementation support. We've seen also, at the policy level, a very good example of cooperation between UNDP and government for circular economy and green finance in Indonesia, low carbon in China, or blue economy and blue bonds in small island states, including in the Pacific. And we see also when we work together with government on national development plan, 5-year plan strategies, we'll see, an increasing attention being paid to those sustainable development issue, water, and their reflection in the plan. But we also see very, concrete example coming from the ground when we work at, at community level. And that's not only about water. It's also about poverty. It's also about inequalities and addressing this together. So we have a kind of great, billion of portfolio of climate change actions. Some of it relates to the restoration of mangrove. That's an important development challenge in Asia and in Vietnam, India, and Bangladesh, and now in the Philippines. We see that the construction work that we've engaged in provides actually a natural buffer against tropical cyclone and offer coastal livelihoods. So that's actually improving the lives of the community. Talking about community, I think also a very good example of ecosystem services and also the use of blended finance in remote areas, for instance, in Indonesia with micro hydropower being given to communities through private and public finance. Also in Myanmar, despite the challenges that we know, rehabilitation of watershed and catchment that we did before have, improved water scarcity, improve actually the catching of rainfall and allows community to do, agricultural work. Agriculture also is important. Fresh water in Vietnam and Sri Lanka, we actually have improved the life of 600,000 people by improving, farming, agricultural practices. It's also about reconstruction. When a disaster strikes, it's about reconstructing better, including for water management and resilience. So that's something we've seen, for instance, with German KfW in eastern Indonesia after the tsunami of 2018. It's also about prevention, and I'll stop here. It is not only response, it's also anticipation, prevention, awareness, early warning systems, prevent a lot of damage, including water-related damage. And the work that we're doing with Japan, using digital technology in a number of Asian countries, I think is a very good example, and you can find more illustration on the UNDP websites. Now, I'm sharing this with you not to tell you only what UNDP does, but I think that's because all these examples that we see coming from the Asian and Pacific countries are, concrete example to address the issue of the conference. How do you tackle climate change and water management? How do you improve the lives of community at the same time? And I'm also telling you this story because most importantly, they're replicable. They can be scaled up in many countries with public finance and with also private finance combined. And this is actually, something that UNDP is very actively engaged in across the region. So to conclude this sharing of thoughts with you, I think the picture is definitely a mixed one. There are very, worrying trends. There are questions about the lack of political will, but we can also see some encouraging light through those country examples, through the use of innovation of technology, through partnership with the private sector, entrepreneurship. And I think it's really a very good way to address SDGs, SDG 6, SDG 14 in the, about the ocean, but also all the SDGs that are related, and the slide from Benoit was very clear. So many sustainable development goals are actually impacted by water in the positive or negative word sense, whether it's poverty, hunger, health, inequalities, or gender. The virus will go away at one point. We hope that there will be no more pandemic, but I think the fundamental question will be whether we're able to use it, to use a crisis as an opportunity to change the course and effectively manage water and climate change for a better future. That's what UNDP is engaged with many countries in Asia and the Pacific, including our country office in Thailand. And I would like to, end this short speech with a note of of hope for cooperation and for a better future. Thank you very much. ขอบคุณครับสวัสดี